The clock on the wall read 3:05 in the afternoon. In 12 minutes, school would be out. The children were restless, watching the clock, thinking about the warm March afternoon waiting outside, about the games they would play and the friends they would meet, and the simple pleasures of a Thursday in East Texas. Some were taking tests. Some were rehearsing for the upcoming interscholastic league competition. Some were in shop class, working with tools their fathers had taught them to use. All of them were alive at 3:05 on March 18, 1937. At 3:17, the new London Consolidated School ceased to exist. The explosion was heard 4 miles away. A column of fire and debris rose hundreds of feet into the Texas sky, carrying with it pieces of what had been the finest school building in the state, fragments of desks and books and walls and children. The 2-story brick structure, 253 feet long and built just 5 years earlier at a cost of over $1 million, lifted off its foundation and collapsed into a crater of rubble and death. The blast was so powerful that a 2-ton concrete slab was thrown clear of the building and crushed a car parked nearby, killing its occupant instantly. Inside the building were approximately 600 students and 40 teachers. Within seconds, nearly 300 of them were dead. The New London School explosion remains the deadliest school disaster in American history. More children died in that single moment than in all school shootings in American history combined up to that point. More teachers died than in any other school tragedy before or since. An entire generation of a small Texas town was erased in an instant, leaving behind parents who would bury children, siblings who would grow up alone, and a community that would never fully recover from what happened at 3:17 on a Thursday afternoon. How does a school explode? How does a building designed to protect and educate children become a death trap that kills them by the hundreds? How does a community that had everything, oil wealth, modern facilities, bright futures for its children, lose it all in a single catastrophic moment? This is the story of New London, Texas, the richest rural school district in America, the decision that doomed its children, and the disaster that changed how we build, how we regulate, and how we protect the places where we send our sons and daughters to learn. If you find value in investigations of American forgotten tragedies, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which disaster to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the explosion. Before the bodies. Before New London became a name that parents whispered with horror. The East Texas oil field was discovered in 1930, and nothing in Rusk County was ever the same again. The Daisy Bradford No. 3 well came in on October 3rd, and within months, the sleepy agricultural region was transformed into the largest oil field in the world. At its peak, the East Texas field produced over 1 million barrels of oil per day, more than any other field on Earth. A gusher of black gold that turned farmers into millionaires and small towns into boom towns overnight. The discovery was made by Columbus Marion Joyner, a 70-year-old wildcatter who had been drilling dry holes for years, who was so broke that he paid his workers in shares of future production rather than wages, who was mocked by the established oil companies as a dreamer and a fool. When the Daisy Bradford came in, showering crude oil over the surrounding cotton fields, Joyner became a legend, and East Texas became the center of the American oil industry. Within a year, over 1,000 wells had been drilled in the field. Within 2 years, there were over 9,000. The derricks rose so close together in some areas that workers could step from one platform to another without touching the ground. The roads that had been dirt tracks became highways choked with oil trucks. The towns that had been crossroads became cities teeming with workers, speculators, merchants, and all the varied humanity that follows wherever wealth erupts from the ground. New London was one of those towns transformed by oil. Located in the heart of the field, the community suddenly found itself sitting on unimaginable wealth. The oil companies paid taxes and royalties that dwarfed anything the local government had ever collected. Landowners who had struggled to grow cotton on difficult soil suddenly received checks larger than their annual income had ever been. Farmers who had wondered how they would pay their mortgages became rich enough to pay cash for whatever they wanted. Money flowed into the town and its institutions with a force almost as powerful as the oil flowing from the ground. The churches built new buildings. The merchants expanded their stores. The roads were paved. The utilities were modernized. Everything that had been shabby and struggling became prosperous and proud. The new London Independent School District became the richest rural school district in the United States, perhaps in the world. Property values soared as oil was discovered beneath farm after farm. Tax revenues multiplied year after year. The district had more money than it knew how to spend, more revenue than districts in major cities could claim, a treasury swollen by oil wealth that seemed inexhaustible. The school board decided to spend that money on its children. They would build a school that would be the envy of Texas, a monument to what a community could achieve when it invested in education, a facility that would prepare the children of New London for futures as bright as the oil wealth that funded them. In 1932, the district began construction on a new consolidated school to replace the scattered rural schools that had served the area. The building was designed by architects who specialized in educational facilities, engineers who understood modern construction techniques, professionals who were paid to create the finest school building possible. The result was a monument to oil wealth and community pride. The main building was a two-story structure of steel and brick and concrete that stretched 253 feet long and cost over $1 million to construct. An astronomical sum in the depths of the Depression, when families elsewhere were struggling to feed their children. The building was designed to be fireproof, with steel framing and masonry walls that would resist flames. It was equipped with the latest educational facilities, with laboratories and shops and specialized classrooms for every subject. It was meant to be a showpiece, proof of what a community could achieve when it had the resources and the will to invest in its future. The building contained 38 classrooms, each designed for optimal lighting and ventilation, each equipped with modern desks and teaching materials. A gymnasium provided space for athletics and assemblies, large enough to seat the entire student body. Laboratories for science and home economics gave students hands-on experience with equipment that many colleges could not afford. Shop facilities taught trades that would serve students who did not pursue higher education. A cafeteria provided hot meals to students who had previously brought cold lunches from home. The heating system was state-of-the-art for its time, a network of gas-fired boilers that provided steam heat throughout the building. Radiators in every room ensured comfortable temperatures even during the coldest Texas winters. The system was efficient, reliable, and considered completely safe. Over 1,000 students from the surrounding area attended classes in the new building, from first grade through high school. The children of oil workers and farmers and businessmen all learned together under one roof, their families' varying circumstances equalized by the shared experience of the finest educational facility in East Texas. The school was integrated by class, if not by race, bringing together students whose parents ranged from roughnecks to executives, all united by their residence in the new London district. By 1937, the school was the pride of the community. Parents pointed to it as evidence of their values, their investment in the future, their commitment to giving their children opportunities they themselves had never had. Teachers came from across the state to work there, attracted by good salaries and excellent facilities. Students took pride in their modern building, their athletic teams, their academic programs that competed with the best in Texas. No one knew that the building was filling with gas. No one knew that the decision made years earlier to save money on heating would kill their children. No one knew that the countdown to catastrophe had already begun. The new London school was heated by a system of gas-fired boilers that provided steam heat throughout the building. Natural gas was abundant in the oil field, and the school district initially contracted with a gas company to provide fuel for the heating system. The arrangement worked well, but it was expensive. The gas company charged commercial rates, and the school's heating bills were substantial. In 1937, the school board made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. They would disconnect from the commercial gas supply and instead tap into a residue gas line that ran near the school property. Residue gas was a byproduct of the oil extraction process, considered waste by the oil companies, essentially free for the taking. Other buildings in the area had done the same thing, tapping into the residue lines to heat their homes and businesses without paying commercial rates. The school maintenance supervisor, a man named W.C. Shaw, installed the connection himself. He ran a pipe from the residue gas line to the school's heating system, providing free fuel that would save the district thousands of dollars annually. The connection was not approved by any regulatory agency because no regulatory agency existed to approve it. There were no building codes requiring inspection of gas connections. There were no safety standards for school construction. The decision was made locally, implemented locally, and supervised by no one outside the district. What Shaw and the school board did not fully understand was the nature of the gas they were bringing into their building. Residue gas was not pure natural gas. It contained heavier hydrocarbons that did not burn as cleanly, that collected in low spaces rather than dissipating, that created explosive mixtures at concentrations that natural gas would not reach. And residue gas had another characteristic that would prove fatal. It was odorless. Natural gas, as we know it today, has a distinctive smell, the rotten egg odor of mercaptan, a chemical added specifically to alert people to gas leaks. But in 1937, no such odorant was required. The residue gas flowing into the new London school had no smell at all. It could accumulate in a space without anyone noticing. It could reach explosive concentrations while children sat at their desks, while teachers taught their lessons, while everyone assumed the building was safe. The gas found its way into the crawl space beneath the school, a void under the building where the concentration could build without detection. Some accounts suggest a leak in the connection. Others suggest that the gas seeped through the soil from the surrounding oil field. Whatever the source, the crawl space became a reservoir of explosive gas, waiting only for a spark to ignite it. The basement of the school was not truly a basement, but a crawl space, a void between the ground and the first floor that allowed access to pipes and wiring. This space was not properly ventilated. The heavy residue gas settled into it and stayed, unable to dissipate, growing more concentrated with each passing day. By March of 1937, the crawl space beneath the new London school contained enough gas to level the building. March 18, 1937, was a Thursday, a normal school day in most respects. The weather was pleasant, the kind of early spring day that made students eager for dismissal. Classes proceeded normally throughout the morning and into the afternoon. The cafeteria served lunch. Teachers gave lessons. Students took notes and daydreamed and watched the clock like students everywhere. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a PTA meeting was held in the gymnasium, which was located in a building separate from the main school. This separation would prove critical. The parents gathered in the gym were not in the main building when the explosion occurred. They would survive to bury their children. In the main building, the school day was winding down. Some students had already been dismissed for various reasons. Others were in different locations around the building: the library, the shop, the classrooms that lined the long hallways. The building held approximately 600 students and 40 teachers at 3:17 p.m. What happened next has been reconstructed from survivor accounts, physical evidence, and engineering analysis. A teacher in the shop area, located in the southeast corner of the building, turned on an electric sanding machine. The switch created a spark, an infinitesimal arc of electricity that would have been completely harmless under normal circumstances. But the circumstances were not normal. The crawl space beneath the shop was saturated with gas at explosive concentrations. The spark found the gas. The gas ignited. The explosion was not a gradual process. It was instantaneous and total. The ignition of the gas beneath the shop triggered a chain reaction that traveled through the connected crawl space at the speed of a pressure wave, detonating the entire reservoir of gas in a single catastrophic moment. The force of the explosion was later estimated at the equivalent of several tons of TNT. The building did not burn. It did not catch fire. It simply ceased to exist as a structure. The walls blew outward. The roof lifted off and came down in fragments. The floors collapsed into the crawl space that had contained the gas. The entire 253-foot length of the building was destroyed in less than a second. The sound was heard in Henderson, 4 miles away. People in nearby towns felt the ground shake. A column of smoke and debris rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles, marking the spot where the finest school in East Texas had stood moments before. In the gymnasium across the campus, the parents at the PTA meeting felt the concussion and heard the roar. They did not immediately understand what had happened. Then they looked out the windows and saw where the main building had been, saw the pile of rubble and the rising smoke, and they began to run. The scene they encountered was beyond comprehension. Where a 2-story building had stood, there was now a mountain of debris, broken bricks and shattered concrete, splintered wood and twisted steel, fragments of desks and books and the belongings of children. And mixed with the debris were the children themselves, some dead, some dying, some crying out for help from beneath the rubble. The parents began digging with their hands. They had no tools, no equipment, no plan. They simply began tearing at the debris, pulling away bricks and boards, searching for any sign of life, calling the names of their children into the dust and smoke. Mothers in their best dresses, dressed for the PTA meeting they had been attending, clawed at the rubble until their fingers bled. Fathers who had rushed from nearby oil fields threw aside chunks of concrete that should have been too heavy to lift, adrenaline giving them strength beyond their normal capacity. The scene was chaos and horror. Debris was scattered over an area larger than a football field. Some sections of the building had collapsed into the basement. Others had been thrown outward by the force of the blast. Fires burned in pockets of the wreckage, adding smoke to the dust that already filled the air. The cries of the injured mixed with the shouts of the rescuers and the wailing of parents who had found their children's bodies. The workers from the nearby oil fields arrived within minutes, their trucks racing down roads they had traveled 1,000 times before, this time carrying them toward a disaster rather than toward another day of work. These were roughnecks and roustabouts, men who worked with heavy equipment and understood rescue operations from their experience with drilling accidents. They had pulled injured men from collapsed derricks, had excavated workers buried in cave-ins, had dealt with explosions and fires and every kind of industrial disaster the oil field could produce. They brought trucks and cranes and cables. They brought shovels and picks and pry bars. They brought muscle and experience and a desperate urgency that drove them beyond exhaustion. Many of them had children in the school. Many of them would find those children dead in the rubble they were excavating. The entire community mobilized in a spontaneous rescue effort that would continue for 18 hours without pause. Every able-bodied man in New London and the surrounding towns joined the work, arriving on foot and by car and by truck, ready to do whatever was needed. The highways leading to New London became clogged with traffic as word spread and volunteers converged from across East Texas. Women set up first aid stations using sheets and bandages from their own homes. They prepared coffee and sandwiches for the workers who would not stop to eat, who refused to rest while children might still be alive beneath the debris. They comforted the injured who were being brought out, held the hands of children who were crying for their mothers, tried to provide some measure of humanity amid the horror. Doctors and nurses from across East Texas converged on the scene, setting up a field hospital in the gymnasium that had sheltered the parents during the explosion. The gymnasium became a triage center, a treatment facility, and eventually a morgue, as the number of dead overwhelmed the facilities available to receive them. Physicians who had expected to treat minor injuries found themselves dealing with trauma that challenged every skill they possessed. The hospitals in nearby towns, Tyler, Henderson, Kilgore, Longview, filled within hours. Ambulances made continuous trips, carrying the injured to whatever facility could receive them, returning empty to pick up more. Some of the injured were transported in private cars, in oilfield trucks, in anything that could move and had space for a stretcher or a body. Governor James Allred learned of the disaster within the hour and immediately mobilized the resources of the state government. He dispatched Texas Rangers to maintain order and coordinate the rescue effort. He sent National Guard troops to assist with the heavy labor of moving debris. He ordered every available state resource to New London, recognizing that this was a disaster beyond the capacity of any local community to handle alone. The highway patrol cleared roads leading to New London, stopping regular traffic to allow emergency vehicles to pass, creating lanes for ambulances and supply trucks. The military sent equipment from bases across Texas, cranes and bulldozers and generators and lighting systems that allowed the rescue work to continue through the night. The Red Cross mobilized disaster response teams, bringing tents and blankets and medical supplies, bringing trained personnel who had dealt with disasters before and could help organize the chaotic rescue effort. Volunteers from chapters across Texas arrived to assist with everything from first aid to food service, to the grim task of cataloging the dead. The dead were brought out one by one, hour after hour, through the afternoon and into the night, and on through the following day. Small bodies wrapped in blankets, carried by men with tears streaming down their faces, laid in rows on the grass outside the gymnasium. The procession was endless, each body another child who would never grow up, another family destroyed, another name to be added to the toll. Identification was often impossible in those first terrible hours. Some children had been so badly injured by the blast that their own parents could not recognize them. The force of the explosion had been so great that bodies were torn apart, features destroyed, identities erased. Others were identified only by their clothing, their jewelry, their school books found near their bodies, small artifacts of ordinary life that became the only means of knowing who had died. The parents searching for their children faced agonizing uncertainty. They moved from body to body, lifting blankets, searching faces, hoping against hope that their child was not among the dead, praying that somehow their son or daughter had escaped. Some found their children quickly. Others searched for hours or days before finally receiving the news they had dreaded. A system was established to catalog the dead and help families locate their children. Volunteers recorded descriptions of each body as it was recovered: clothing, hair color, approximate age, any identifying marks. Lists were posted and updated as identifications were made. The gymnasium became not just a morgue, but a headquarters for the grim bureaucracy of mass casualty. The toll mounted with each passing hour. The number of confirmed dead rose from dozens to scores to hundreds. By nightfall of the first day, over 200 bodies had been recovered, and rescuers knew that more remained in the debris. The hospitals filled with the injured, many of whom would not survive their wounds, their deaths adding to the toll in the days that followed. The morgues in New London and the surrounding towns overflowed within hours. Temporary facilities had to be established to hold the bodies until families could claim them. A local furniture store donated its space, the floor where sofas and beds had been displayed now covered with the bodies of children. Other businesses opened their doors for the same terrible purpose. Embalming supplies ran short as funeral homes across East Texas exhausted their stocks. Caskets had to be shipped in from Dallas and Houston and cities across the South. The undertakers worked around the clock, preparing bodies for burial, trying to give families the closure of seeing their children one last time before they were interred. The final death toll was never precisely determined. Official counts ranged from 293 to 319 students and teachers killed. The number most commonly cited is 295, but even this figure is uncertain. Some victims died later from their injuries, days or weeks after the explosion, their deaths directly caused by the disaster but not always counted in the official toll. Some were never recovered from the debris, their remains buried so deeply or so damaged that identification was impossible. Some were buried by families without being recorded in official tallies, interred in family plots with private ceremonies that left no public record. What is certain is that the New London explosion killed more American school children in a single incident than any other event in history. It remains the deadliest school disaster ever to occur in the United States, a record that has stood for nearly 9 decades and that, God willing, will never be broken. The funerals began the next day and continued for weeks. The churches of Russ County held multiple services each day, their pastors delivering eulogy after eulogy, their pews filled with grieving families who had lost children, siblings, friends. Some families buried multiple children, mothers and fathers who had sent 2 or 3 or 4 children to school that morning and would never see any of them alive again. The cemeteries filled with small graves, rows of headstones marking lives cut short on a Thursday afternoon in March. Pleasant Hill Cemetery, New London Cemetery, family plots scattered across the county, all received the bodies of children who should have had decades of life ahead of them. The gravediggers worked continuously, opening graves as fast as the funerals could be conducted, the earth of Russ County absorbing its children in quantities that no community should ever have to endure. Some families held private funerals. Others chose public services that became community expressions of grief. The town united in mourning, neighbors supporting neighbors, strangers offering comfort to strangers, everyone joined by the shared experience of loss that had touched virtually every family in the district. The entire nation mourned with New London. Newspapers across the country carried the story on their front pages. President Franklin Roosevelt sent condolences. The governor attended funerals and memorial services. The tragedy touched a nerve in the American consciousness, the nightmare that every parent fears made real in the worst possible way. The investigation that followed was extensive and thorough, the most comprehensive inquiry into a school disaster that had ever been conducted in the United States. Engineers examined the rubble, analyzing the patterns of destruction to determine the origin and force of the blast. Chemists analyzed samples of gas collected from the surrounding area, comparing them to the residue gas that had been supplied to the school. Investigators interviewed survivors, witnesses, school officials, and anyone else who might have information about the conditions that led to the explosion. A military board of inquiry was convened, bringing the resources and expertise of the federal government to bear on understanding what had happened. The board included engineers, chemists, and investigators who had experience with explosions and industrial accidents. They worked for weeks examining evidence, taking testimony, reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to the deaths of nearly 300 children. The findings were devastating in their simplicity. The school had been connected to an unapproved gas source, the residue gas line that maintenance supervisor W.C. Shaw had tapped to save money on heating bills. The gas had accumulated in an unventilated space beneath the building, the crawl space that ran the length of the structure. A spark had ignited the gas, the electrical arc from the sanding machine in the shop classroom. The building had been destroyed, instantly, completely, catastrophically. The fault did not lie with any malicious act. No one had intended to harm the children. The school board had been trying to save money, exercising what they believed was as prudent stewardship of district resources. The maintenance supervisor had been following common local practice, doing what other buildings in the oil field had done without incident. The teachers had been doing their jobs, educating students in what they believed was a safe environment. Everyone had believed the building was safe because no one had told them otherwise. The fault lay with a system that had no safeguards, no regulations, no oversight. There was no agency responsible for inspecting school buildings in Texas. There was no code requiring proper ventilation of crawl spaces in public buildings. There was no requirement that gas lines be professionally installed and inspected. There was no law mandating that natural gas contain an odorant to alert people to leaks. The absence of regulation was not an oversight. It reflected the philosophy of the era, the belief that government should not interfere in local decisions, that communities knew best how to manage their own affairs. That regulation was an intrusion on freedom rather than a protection of safety. The oil industry operated with minimal oversight. The construction industry built according to local custom rather than uniform codes. The assumption was that people would act responsibly without being required to do so. New London demonstrated the cost of that assumption. When there were no regulations, there were no safeguards. When there were no inspections, there was no way to catch hazards before they became disasters. When there was no requirement for gas odorants, there was no way for anyone to know that the building was filling with explosive gas until it was too late. All of these failures were corrected in the aftermath of the disaster. The Texas legislature passed a series of laws requiring safety standards for school buildings. Inspections became mandatory. Ventilation requirements were established. The ad hoc construction practices that had been acceptable before New London were replaced by professional standards and government oversight. The oil and gas industry implemented requirements for adding odorants to natural gas. The distinctive rotten egg smell that we now associate with gas leaks, the smell of mercaptan, a sulfur-containing compound added specifically to make gas detectable, was mandated because of what happened at New London. The industry that had produced the gas that killed the children took steps to ensure that such a tragedy could not happen again. The mercaptan odorant that makes natural gas detectable today is a direct legacy of the New London explosion. Every time someone smells a gas leak and calls for help, every time a family evacuates a home because they detect the telltale odor, every time a potential disaster is averted because someone noticed the smell of gas, they are benefiting from a safety measure that was written in the blood of Texas school children. Other states followed Texas's lead. Building codes were strengthened across the country. Gas odorant requirements were adopted nationwide. The lessons of New London were incorporated into the regulatory framework that governs building safety to this day. The children who died in the explosion had, in their deaths, created protections that would save countless lives in the decades that followed. The school was rebuilt, but not on the same site. The community could not bear to build on the ground where their children had died, could not send a new generation of students to walk over the earth that had swallowed their predecessors. The site of the explosion was left as it was, cleared of debris but otherwise undeveloped, a void in the landscape that marked the void in the community's heart. The new school was constructed nearby, opened in 1939 after 2 years of construction and planning. It was built with ventilation systems and safety features that the original had lacked, designed by engineers who understood the lessons of the disaster, inspected by officials who had the authority to enforce safety standards. The new building was meant to be not just a school, but a promise that the community would never again sacrifice the safety of its children for any consideration. The students who filled the new school carried the weight of what had happened. Many had lost siblings in the explosion. Most had lost classmates and friends. All had been touched by the disaster in some way, had attended funerals, had seen the grief that had broken families throughout the district. They walked through the new building's doors knowing that they were the survivors, the ones who had been given a chance that nearly 300 of their peers had been denied. A memorial was erected on the site of the explosion, a cenotaph listing the names of the victims, a monument to the children and teachers who had died because the adults responsible for their safety had made decisions without understanding their consequences. The memorial was dedicated with ceremony and grief, with speeches and prayers and tears, with a community's determination that the dead would not be forgotten. The cenotaph still stands today, maintained by the community, protected by the county, visited by people who want to pay their respects to the victims of a disaster that should never have happened. The granite monument lists the names in alphabetical order, each name representing a life cut short, a future denied, a family devastated. The names are legible after nearly 9 decades of Texas weather, carved deep enough to last for centuries more. The memorial site has been expanded over the years. A museum was added to tell the story of the disaster, to explain what happened and why, to preserve the artifacts and photographs and testimonies that document the tragedy. The museum displays pieces of the original building, personal effects of the victims, newspaper accounts from across the country. It tells the story with the respect and solemnity that the subject demands. Every March 18th, survivors and descendants gather at the memorial site for an anniversary observance. The ceremony has been held every year since the disaster, an unbroken chain of remembrance that has continued for nearly 90 years. The participants read the names of the dead, all 295 of them, a recitation that takes considerable time and that serves to individualize the tragedy, to remind listeners that each name represents a person who lived and was loved and is missed. Flowers are laid at the memorial. Prayers are offered. Speeches are made about the importance of remembrance, about the lessons of the disaster. about the obligation to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. The crowd grows smaller each year as the survivors age and die, as the generations that remember the disaster personally give way to generations that know it only through stories and documents. But the ceremony continues, maintained by descendants and community members who understand that some memories must be kept alive. The survivors themselves have almost all passed away now. The children who escaped the building in 1937 would be in their 90s if they were still alive, and most have joined the classmates they left behind so long ago. The last reunions of survivors were held in the early 2000s, gatherings of elderly men and women who shared memories of a day that had shaped the rest of their lives. Their testimonies were recorded by historians and documentarians who understood that living memory of the disaster would soon be gone. The survivors spoke of what they remembered: the moment of the explosion, the chaos that followed, the faces of friends they had seen that morning. They spoke of the decades that had followed, of lives lived in the shadow of the disaster, of the question that never stopped haunting them: why did I survive when so many others died? The story of New London faded from national consciousness as other tragedies claimed the headlines, as war and depression and the concerns of daily life pushed the memory aside. The disaster that had shocked the nation in 1937 became a footnote in history books, mentioned briefly, if at all, overshadowed by other catastrophes that seemed more dramatic or more recent. But in East Texas, the memory persisted. The families who had lost children passed down the stories to their descendants. The community that had buried its young maintained the memorial and the tradition of remembrance. The museum preserved the artifacts and documents that told the story. New London refused to let the disaster be forgotten, even as the rest of the nation moved on. Today, the New London explosion is largely unknown outside of East Texas. It does not appear in most American history textbooks, crowded out by wars and presidents and movements that seem more important to the national narrative. It is not commemorated with a national memorial or a federal holiday. The names of the victims are not widely known beyond the community that lost them, but in New London, the memory endures. The cenotaph still stands on the site where the school once stood. The names are still carved in stone, still readable after nearly 9 decades. The museum still welcomes visitors who want to learn about what happened. The community still gathers every March to remember, to mourn, to ensure that the children who died are not forgotten. The question that haunted the survivors, why did this happen, has been answered by investigators and engineers. The gas accumulated. The spark ignited it. The building was destroyed. The mechanical explanation is complete, documented in reports and testimonies and the physical evidence of the blast. But the deeper question, how could this have been allowed to happen, has no satisfying answer. The adults responsible for the safety of those children did not know they were putting them at risk. They thought they were saving money, providing heat, running a school. They did not understand the danger because no one had warned them, because no regulations required safety measures, because the knowledge that could have saved those children had not yet been learned. The children of New London paid the price for that ignorance. Their deaths taught the lessons that now protect other children. The safety codes and building standards and gas odorants that exist today are their legacy, purchased at a price that should never have been paid. Some spoke about the experience, sharing their stories with journalists and historians and documentarians who sought to preserve the memory of what had happened. They described the moment of the explosion, the chaos that followed, the faces of classmates they had seen that morning and would never see again. Their testimonies formed the historical record that allows us to understand what happened on March 18, 1937. Others could never bring themselves to discuss it. They buried the memories as deeply as they could, refusing to answer questions, changing the subject when the explosion was mentioned, carrying their trauma in silence for decades. Some moved away from New London, seeking distance from a place that held too many painful associations. Others stayed but avoided the memorial site, unable to face the cenotaph that listed the names of friends who had died beside them. The teachers who survived faced a particular burden of guilt that no therapy could fully resolve. They were the adults in the building, the ones who had been responsible for the safety of the children in their care. They had done nothing wrong. They could not have known about the gas, could not have prevented the explosion, could not have saved students who died in an instant. But the knowledge of their innocence did not ease the feeling that they should have done something, should have protected the children who had trusted them. One teacher, a man who had been on the second floor when the explosion occurred, spent the rest of his life wondering why he had survived when so many of his students had died. He visited the memorial every year on the anniversary, laid flowers, read the names of the students he had taught, and asked questions that had no answers. He lived into his 90s, outliving most of his contemporaries, carrying the memory of that Thursday afternoon for more than 60 years. The parents who lost children faced grief that no time could heal. The love that had been invested in raising a child, the dreams that had been built around their future, the daily presence that had been the center of family life, all of it was erased in a moment, leaving a void that could never be filled. Some parents never recovered. Marriages broke under the strain of shared grief. Mental health deteriorated in the absence of treatment that the era could not provide. Lives that had been full of hope became lives of endurance, of getting through each day without the child who should have been there. Some left New London, unable to remain in a place haunted by memories of what they had lost. They sold their homes, left their jobs, moved to cities where no one knew their story, where they could try to build new lives without the constant reminders of the children they had buried. They scattered across Texas and beyond, carrying their grief to places where the name New London meant nothing. Others stayed, caring for the graves of their children, participating in memorial services, keeping the memory alive so that the deaths would not be meaningless. They became the guardians of remembrance, the ones who ensured that the anniversary was observed, that the cenotaph was maintained, that the story was passed to younger generations who had not been there but needed to know what had happened. The community itself was forever changed. New London had been a boomtown, a place of optimism and growth and faith in the future. The oil wealth had seemed like a blessing, a gift that would provide prosperity for generations. After the explosion, the oil wealth was revealed as something more complicated, a fortune that had built the school that killed the children, that had funded the decision to save money on gas that had led to catastrophe. The town did not die, but it was never the same. The population that had been growing began to decline as families left and were not replaced. The businesses that had prospered serving the school community struggled without the customers who had patronized them. The optimism that had characterized the oil boom years was replaced by a somber awareness of how quickly fortune could turn to tragedy. The oil wealth continued to flow, but it could not replace what had been lost. Money could build a new school, could maintain the memorial, could provide for the material needs of the survivors and the bereaved. But money could not bring back the children. Money could not heal the wounds that the explosion had inflicted on families and on the community as a whole. The richest rural school district in America had paid a price that no amount of wealth could ever redeem. The story of New London faded from national consciousness as other tragedies claimed the headlines, as war and depression and the concerns of daily life pushed the memory aside. But in East Texas, the memory persisted. Families passed down the stories to their children and grandchildren. The memorial services continued year after year. The cenotaph was maintained and the graves were tended. Every March 18th, survivors and descendants gather at the memorial site. They read the names of the dead. They lay flowers on graves. They remember the children who never grew up, the teachers who never grew old, the community that was shattered on a Thursday afternoon in 1937. The lessons of New London are still relevant today. Buildings still explode when gas accumulates in unventilated spaces. Schools still face safety hazards that go undetected until disaster strikes. The impulse to cut costs, to take shortcuts, to assume that safety can be compromised without consequence. That impulse is as strong today as it was in 1937. What has changed is the regulatory framework that governs building safety. The codes and inspections and standards that we take for granted today did not exist when the New London School was built. They exist now because of what happened there, because the deaths of nearly 300 children demonstrated the cost of leaving safety to chance, of trusting that buildings would be safe without requiring that they actually be safe. The children of New London did not die in vain, though that is cold comfort to the families who lost them. Their deaths led to changes that have saved countless lives in the decades since. Every school building that is inspected, every gas line that is properly installed, every crawl space that is properly ventilated, all of these safety measures trace their origin, directly or indirectly, to the tragedy that occurred on March 18, 1937. But the children themselves are still gone. The boys who would have become men, the girls who would have become women, the futures that were erased in a single explosive moment, none of that can be recovered. The memorial lists their names, but names are not lives. The flowers laid on their graves are not the flowers they would have picked for their own children. The years that have passed are years they did not live. The youngest victims were 6 years old, first graders who had barely begun their education. The oldest were 18, seniors who were weeks away from graduation, from the beginning of their adult lives. In between were children of every age, at every stage of childhood and adolescence, united only by the fact that they were in the wrong building at the wrong moment on the wrong day. Their teachers died with them, adults who had dedicated their lives to education, who had taken responsibility for other people's children, who had done nothing wrong except to be in a building that no one knew was dangerous. The teachers' deaths were no less tragic for being less numerous. Each represented a life of service cut short, a career ended, a family devastated. Today, the New London explosion is largely forgotten outside of East Texas. It does not appear in most American history textbooks. It is not commemorated with a national memorial. The names of the victims are not widely known beyond the community that lost them. But in New London, the memory endures. The cenotaph still stands on the site where the school once stood. The names are still carved in stone, still readable after nearly 9 decades of Texas weather. The community still gathers every March to remember, to mourn, to ensure that the children who died are not forgotten. The question that haunted the survivors, why did this happen, has been answered by investigators and engineers. The gas accumulated, the spark ignited it, the building was destroyed. The mechanical explanation is complete. But the deeper question, how could this have been allowed to happen, has no satisfying answer. The adults responsible for the safety of those children did not know they were putting them at risk. They thought they were saving money, providing heat, running a school. They did not understand the danger because no one had warned them, because no regulations required safety measures, because the knowledge that could have saved those children had not yet been learned. The children of New London paid the price for that ignorance. Their deaths taught the lessons that now protect other children. The safety codes and building standards and gas odorants that exist today are their legacy, purchased at a price that should never have been paid. At 3:17 on March 18, 1937, approximately 600 children and teachers were in the New London Consolidated School. By 3:18, nearly half of them were dead or dying. The clock on the wall, if it survived the blast, would have shown a time just 12 minutes before the end of the school day, 12 minutes before the children would have walked out the doors and gone home to their families. 12 minutes that separated life from death for 300 young people who had done nothing wrong except to be in school on a Thursday afternoon. The clock stopped at 3:17. The children stopped with it. The futures that should have been lived were erased in a flash of fire and pressure and destruction. All that remains are the names on the cenotaph, the stories told by survivors, and the safety regulations written in the blood of children who deserved to grow up, to live, to become the adults they would never have the chance to be. New London, Texas. Population today, approximately 1,000. Distance from the nearest major city, about 120 miles to Dallas. Industry. Oil and gas, as it has been since 1930. Notable feature. A memorial to 295 children and teachers killed in the worst school disaster in American history. The oil still flows from the East Texas field, though not as abundantly as it once did. The wealth that built the school that killed the children is still being extracted, still being sold, still generating the revenue that once made New London the richest rural school district in America. The gas that killed them has been tamed, at least partially. The odorants added after the disaster make leaks detectable. The regulations enacted after the explosion make buildings safer. The inspections required after the tragedy catch hazards before they become catastrophes, but the children are still dead. The memorial still stands. The names are still carved in stone. And every March, the people of New London still gather to remember what happened when a school exploded and nearly 300 children died in the 12 minutes before they would have gone home. Some disasters teach lessons that prevent future disasters. New London taught lessons that have saved countless lives, but for the families who buried their children in March of 1937, for the survivors who lived with the memory for the rest of their days, for the community that was shattered and never fully healed, the lessons are cold comfort. The children deserved to live. They deserved to grow up. They deserved futures that were stolen from them by a decision to save money on heating, by a connection to a gas line that should never have been made, by the absence of regulations that should have existed, by failures of adults who should have protected them. They did not get what they deserved. They got 12 minutes of Thursday afternoon, and then they got oblivion. This is the story of New London, Texas, the richest school district in rural America, the finest school building in the state, the decision that doomed 295 children to die in a moment of fire and destruction, and the legacy of safety regulations, building codes, and gas odorants that exist because of them. They are remembered. They should be remembered. They should never be forgotten. March 18th, 1937, 3:17 p.m. The clock stopped. The children stopped. The world changed. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten American tragedy should we explore next? The deadliest flood in American history? The circus fire that killed 167? The dam that drowned a town? Every tragedy has a story. Every story has lessons. Every lesson was paid for in blood. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.